South Korea and Poland agreed Monday to elevate their bilateral relations to a comprehensive strategic partnership, pledging closer collaboration in defense and energy supply chains following a summit between their leaders. U.S. President Donald Trump has threatened to block all vessels passing through the Strait of Hormuz, declaring a counter-blockade against Iran. Iran is rejecting the U.S. threats and vowing to control the Strait of Hormuz. And oil prices surged back above $100 a barrel as Asian markets reopened on Monday after U.S. Iran talks ended without a deal and President Donald Trump announced plans to blockade Iranian ports. We are now less than 3 hours away from the U.S. imposing a maritime blockade on vessels headed or departing from Iranian ports. Now, Iran has denounced the decision and the U.S. for undermining the ceasefire negotiations held over the weekend. An Sung-jin starts us off.
As tensions escalate amid unresolved ceasefire negotiations between Washington and Tehran, the U.S. will begin enforcing a maritime blockade on all vessels entering or leaving Iranian ports within hours. The U.S. Central Command announced the measure on Sunday, saying the blockade will begin at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Monday. The blockade will not apply to ships that are destined for ports outside of Iran. President Trump had confirmed the timing of the blockade in a Truth Social post. The move is allegedly seen as a countermeasure to Iran's continued control of the Strait of Hormuz, despite a ceasefire agreement. By targeting Iran's maritime trade, especially its oil exports, Washington seeks to increase pressure on Tehran. Iran strongly condemned the decision, with its parliamentary speaker warning that Tehran would respond by fighting back. He also added that the blockade could drive global oil prices higher, inherently affecting American consumers. Iran's foreign minister also denounced the U.S. for undermining negotiations in Islamabad, especially for making excessive demands. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has also warned that any attempt by the U.S. to enforce a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz will be met with a strong military retaliation. The decision comes after a breakdown of the first round of negotiations between the two countries held over 21 hours in Pakistan. Talks reportedly failed over disagreements, including the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, pushing tensions to their highest level since the ceasefire began. Though analysts say this move comes as Washington looks to leverage maritime control on the negotiating table, fears remain over a potential military force clash between the U.S. and Iran over the Strait of Hormuz. An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
Now here in Seoul, President Lee Jae-myung hosted Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk at the Blue House today for their first summit talks. The summit led the two countries to upgrade their ties to a comprehensive strategic partnership. Our Blue House correspondent Song Yu-jin reports on the summit's key outcomes.
Wearing a tie in the colors of Poland's national flag, President Lee Jae-myung welcomed Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk to the Blue House on Monday for their first summit. Yi and Tusk agreed to upgrade South Korea and Poland's strategic partnership to a comprehensive strategic partnership. As expected, defense ties were at the center of the talks.
양국의 고해적 방산 협력은 더욱 확대될 것입니다. 저는 양국 간의 방산 협력이 심화 발전할 수 있도록 이미 체결한 총괄 계약의 안정적 이행이 필요하다고 말씀드렸습니다.
Defense cooperation remains the key driving force of our bilateral relations. We will continue with this cooperation while also accelerating technology transfer, localization, and the relocation of production facilities to Poland.
The remarks refer to a defense framework agreement worth more than $44 billion signed in 2022, South Korea's largest overseas arms deal to date. Since then, Korean defense firms have signed follow-up contracts to supply equipment such as K-2 tanks and K-9 self-propelled howitzers. Beyond defense, the two sides are set to expand cooperation in energy, infrastructure, and high-tech industries. President Lee particularly called for Poland's support in helping Korean battery firms enter the country's energy storage system market. Prime Minister Tusk, noting that South Korea is Asia's largest investor in Poland, said he would continue efforts to ensure a favorable business environment. Also discussed was coping with the fallout from the war in the Middle East.
또한 양국 모두 중동 전쟁이 불러온 위기에 대처하기 위해 글로벌 공급망의 안정화가 중요하다는 점에 공감하였고, 이를 위해 필요한 협력을 이어나가기로 뜻을 모았습니다.
We must work together toward a new geopolitical balance and peace, and I believe Poland and the Republic of Korea should join forces in this effort.
The summit wrapped up with an official lunch featuring a blend of Korean and Polish cuisine.
The Polish Prime Minister's visit comes less than 2 weeks after President Yi hosted the leaders of France and Indonesia at the Blue House. The visit marks another in a series of recent summits as global uncertainties persist. 송유진, Arirang News.
South Korea's parliament is wrapping up its 3-day interpellation session today, with the final round of questioning centered on education, society, and cultural affairs. Our Moon-Hae-in has the details.
The National Assembly convened on Monday afternoon for the final day of its 3-day interpellation session, with lawmakers turning their focus to education, society, and cultural affairs. Prime Minister Kim Min-seok joined key cabinet members, including the Ministers of Justice, Interior and Education, for a wide-ranging round of questioning that touched on several sensitive issues. Political tensions ran high as lawmakers clashed over a series of controversies ahead of the June 3rd local elections. At the heart of the controversy were allegations of prosecutorial misconduct and the previous decision not to indict a mayoral candidate in Busan over alleged illicit payments. Lawmakers pressed ministers on concerns about fairness and potential political bias in investigations, to which they pledged to tighten standards.
Going forward, we'll make sure this doesn't happen again by handling things more fairly and thoroughly, especially in election-related cases, under stricter standards.
But the session wasn't solely consumed by political disputes. Lawmakers also turned their attention to issues closer to home for many South Koreans, such as education policy. Education Minister Choi Min-jeong said a restricted phone for students designed for learning use could be a meaningful way to address excessive smartphone use among younger children, but several factors such as broad social consensus would be needed before moving forward. He also highlighted plans to promote reading from an early age.
We plan to designate pilot institutions focused on reading, strengthen teachers' capabilities in reading education, and expand programs linked with libraries to help foster a reading culture from early childhood.
With both sides using the session to sharpen their positions, the day's proceedings carried added weight, not only as a check on government policy, but as a signal of where the political battle lines will be drawn ahead. Moon-Hae-in, Arirang News.
In other news, North Korea's Kim Jong-un has highlighted the task of promoting ties with China as his regime's top priority. The remarks to this end were made during talks with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. According to the regime state media, the talks took place on Friday, the first day of Wang Yi's 2-day visit to Pyongyang. North Korea is also set to support China's policy for a multipolar world, keeping in mind the importance of advancing ties to safeguard common interests. The Chinese diplomat, for his part, claimed Beijing-Pyongyang ties have entered a new phase of development following last year's summit between Kim and Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Global oil prices surge again as tensions around the Strait of Hormuz intensify. Iran warns that a U.S. blockade could push prices even higher, while President Donald Trump acknowledges that oil prices may stay high through November in time for the midterm elections. Kim So-young has this report.
After ceasefire talks collapsed, Trump's next move was to announce a U.S. blockade targeting Iranian ports and vessels.
We have a blockade going into effect. That'll be 10 o'clock tomorrow. Other nations are working so that Iran will not be able to sell oil.
With Iran closing off a key shipping route and Washington's blockade, traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has become increasingly disrupted. Brent crude futures jumped 8.7% from the previous session to above $103 a barrel. U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude also surged by roughly 8.7%, nearing $105 a barrel. President Trump is also said to have acknowledged that oil prices may stay elevated through the fall, a rare acknowledgement of a potential political fallout from the war. Meanwhile, Iran responded with a stark warning on rising fuel prices. Iran's parliament speaker, Mohammad Bagher Khalibaf, posted on social media that Americans soon will be nostalgic for paying $4 to $5 a gallon for gasoline, telling people to enjoy the current pump figures. Before the war, the average price of gasoline in the U.S. had remained below $3 a gallon. But by April, prices had climbed above $4 a gallon nationwide. Experts also warned that Washington's blockade could send energy prices even higher and prolong market instability.
I don't think Trump has any escalatory paths out of this war if he moves forward with this blockade. Moreover, if he really goes forward with all of this, then it is very likely that the Houthis will close off the Red Sea as well. That's another 12% oil flow globally that will be lost, together with the 20% that has been jeopardized by what the Iranians are doing in the Straits of Hormuz. That would shoot up oil prices, probably closer to $200.
The latest spike in tensions has also sent European natural gas prices sharply higher. Gold slipped as fears of a prolonged conflict fueled broader market volatility. Spot gold is currently trading at around $4,700 an ounce. With no sign of breakthrough in negotiations, markets are bracing for even greater volatility. Kim Seo-young, Arirang News.
And a U.S. blockade on Iranian ports starting tonight is sending shockwaves through South Korea's economy. Heavily reliant on Middle Eastern crude, domestic industries face an imminent supply cliff and surging costs as the government rushes to respond. Kim Do-yeon reports.
The United States is set to enforce a total maritime blockade on all Iranian ports starting Monday, which could cripple South Korea's core industries. With Middle Eastern crude accounting for 70% of imports, domestic refiners and petrochemical companies face an imminent supply cliff. Domestic economists point out that the blockade adds a complex diplomatic and economic burden on Seoul.
While this should be resolved through negotiations with Iran, the Trump administration's blockade of Hormuz has created a new dilemma, especially given Washington's current unfavorable view of Seoul. We now have the Trump risk compounding our existing problems, making the situation progressively worse.
The Minister of Trade, Industry and Resources Kim Jong-un conducted emergency inspections on Monday at 4 petrochemical manufacturing facilities. To prevent supply chain disruptions in essential sectors, the government is allocating 674.4 billion won from a supplementary budget passed last week to subsidize the import of naphtha from non-Middle Eastern regions. The ministry is also drafting emergency regulations to ban the hoarding of raw petrochemical materials. However, global market analysts warn the ripple effects will be severe across the region's major economies.
So you're going to see, especially markets like in Japan, in Korea, in India, those markets are going to be hit hard, especially sectors that heavily rely on oil, right? So oil transportation, sectors such as airlines, such as transportation, consumer cyclicals, chemicals, those sectors are going to be hit the hardest.
The domestic aviation sector is already bracing for the shock. For airlines where fuel constitutes a significant portion of operating budgets, the financial impact is severe. The mounting strain is forcing low-cost carriers into emergency measures. T-Way Air announced on Monday it is accepting applications for voluntary unpaid leave from its cabin crew for May and June. Global freight rates are climbing steadily, placing severe financial strain on export-driven small and medium-sized enterprises. Unlike large corporations, SMEs rely heavily on spot contracts, leaving them fully exposed to surging logistics costs. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
BTS's Arirang World Tour has sparked much speculation about the potential economic gains of the group's performances, given its remarkable global fan base. Our Park Jun-han tells us more.
To create unforgettable moments, global BTS fans ARMY visited South Korea to enjoy the opening week of the group's world tour Arirang in Goyang. And when fans visit, they don't just come to Korea for the concert, but also to experience the culture.
Beyond the music and merch, what we are seeing here is real economic activity. As fans travel, shop, and dine, their spending spreads across the local economy, driving consumption in Korea.
From BTS-themed city tours to activities like merch shopping and local dining, these fans transformed their concert trip into a cultural and spending experience.
Once you come here for BTS, you are part of this economical impact because you fly, you buy stuff here, you buy accommodation, so everything you do that is related to them increase economy of Korea.
Hallyu Wave is a big impact for us because as we fans, we really consume and we really buy what our idols are using or endorsing. K-pop in general really attracts tourists to go here in South Korea.
Over the last 10 years, there has been a meaningful increase in the number of foreign visitors to South Korea. From just over 13 million people in 2015, the number in 2025 rose to almost 19 million, up over 43%.
Travel patterns these days are no longer centered on simple sightseeing, but rather on experiencing local culture firsthand and living like a local. For people who are big fans, there are likely to be fewer constraints on spending.
The largest ever by a K-pop act, BTS is visiting 34 cities for a total of 85 shows as part of the group's world tour, which is projected to generate at least $1 billion in direct revenue for the group's agency HYBE and have a multi-billion-dollar impact on the global economy. This is a powerful reminder of the strengths of BTSnomics. Park Jun-han, Arirang News.
And BTS's fifth album, Arirang, remains at the top of the Billboard 200 for a third week in a row. Now, this is the first time for any K-pop act to spend 3 weeks at #1 on this chart. Now, the previous best was 2 non-consecutive weeks achieved by the soundtrack to K-pop Demon Hunters. The Billboard 200 ranks albums based on overall consumption, including physical sales and streaming. With this milestone, BTS also becomes the first group in 13 years to spend 3 weeks at #1. Time now to take a look at what's been happening in the world of sports. For that, we turn to our sports editor, Paul Neat, joining us here in the studio. Happy to have you with us, Paul.
Thank you. Happy to be back.
Paul, let's start with a momentous achievement from South Korean badminton star An Se-young, a first Asian title for #1 spot, right?
Yes, she won the Badminton Asia Championships in Ningbo, China on Sunday. It was An's first ever Asian title. I mean, she has now completed something of an unofficial Grand Slam and is the first female and singles badminton player from South Korea to do so. After winning Olympic and Asian Games gold and a world title, the world #1 has now completed the full set. On Sunday, An Se-young overcame her rival Wang Yi of China 21-12, 17-21, 21-18 in the first game, and came from 5-4 down to go on to win before losing the second match. But her resilience meant Game 3 was hers, going 9-3 ahead at one stage before being pegged back to 15 each. Elsewhere, men's double stars So Sung-jae and Kim Won-ho also claimed gold, beating fellow countrymen Kang Min-hyuk and Kim Dong-ju in the final.
Really excellent achievement and so proud of her. Now, speaking of, KBO has reached yet another attendance milestone. Tell us more about that.
Another one, yes, indeed. 1 million fans in the fastest paced yet. 55 games is all that it took for KBO to reach 1 million fans. This beats the previous record by 5 games set just last year. On Friday, with the 5 KBO games drawing over 91,000 fans, KBO ticked over the 1 million mark. Last year's champions, the LG Twins, they sit joint top with KT Wiz on 9 wins and 4 losses. The Twins are on a 7-game winning run and face a Lotte Giants side starting this Tuesday that had been on a 7-match winless run before back-to-back wins over the Kiwoom Heroes on Friday and then Saturday. Last year's runners-up, the Hanwha Eagles, meanwhile, sit languishing in 7th. Last year, KBO set a new all-time record of 12.3 million fans and looks on course to break that record this year.
Right, baseball is even more popular than ever. Now, to K-League football now, it looks like FC Seoul are the real deal after all.
Does indeed, yes. They beat Jeonbuk on Saturday to remain top of the K-League 1 table. A goal from Patrick Klemala in the 95th minute earned FC Seoul a 1-0 win over the reigning champions. Their first home win over Jeonbuk in nearly 9 years. Seoul are seeking a first K-League title in 10 years and have started the new season very well and are now 3 points clear at the top of the league, despite having played a game fewer than most teams, with 5 wins and 1 draw from 6 games. This Wednesday, they face second-place Ulsan HD in something of an early title showdown.
I see. And finally, in short track speed skating, it looks, after all, as though Choi Min-jeong will retire soon.
Right, 7-time Olympic medalist Choi Min-jeong looks set to call it a day on the international stage. Now, ahead of a national team selection competition on Thursday, Choi told the media that she thinks this will be her last. She finished first overall following the second part of the 2-stage trials on Sunday to qualify for the 2026-2027 season. On Sunday in Seoul, Choi won the 500 metres and 1500 metres to go with a first-place finish in the 500 and third place in the 1500 in the first phase last week. After the Winter Olympics in February, Choi said that the Milan Games could be her last, or would be her last rather, but now it seems that the next World Championships will be her last on the international stage altogether. And as luck would have it, the final event will be in Seoul in 2027.
That's exciting. What a fitting send-off that could turn out to be. Great stuff as always, Paul. I'll see you next Monday.
Thank you. Yeah.
Again, tomorrow we'll see weather more typical of late May. Daytime highs will rise to around 25 degrees Celsius, making it feel quite mild. So you can go for lighter clothing during the day. However, temperatures will drop sharply in the mornings and evenings, with a big day-to-night temperature difference of around 15 to 20 degrees. Looking ahead, Jeju Island will see rain from early tomorrow morning through Wednesday morning, while the southern coast may see some rain from tomorrow afternoon into the evening. Rainfall will remain on the lighter side, with Jeju Island expected to see between 5 and 30 millimeters, while the southern coastal areas will see less than 5 millimeters. As for temperatures tomorrow, Seoul will start the day at 12 degrees Celsius, Chuncheon at 9 degrees, Daejeon at 11 degrees. Then by the afternoon, Seoul will get up to 25 degrees, Chuncheon at 25 degrees as well, Gwangju at 23 degrees. Temperatures will remain above seasonal averages for the time being, bringing mild conditions, but large day-to-night temperature swings will continue.
That is all we have for tonight. I'm Kim Da-mi. From all of us here at Arirang, thanks for watching and good night.
Good evening and welcome to the 10 o'clock edition of Arirang News. Thanks for joining us on this special day, a day in which Arirang TV first goes on the air.
Arirang TV is Korea's first.
From all of us here at Arirang, thank you for watching. Here's to the next 30 years.
Knock knock! The magical door to the world of K-animation is swinging wide open. Meet your instant new BFF, the adorable Catch. Tina Ping will have you hooked from the very first glance. Need a hand? Our Robocar Pony Rescue team is always zooming in to save the day. How about tagging along on Pink Fong and Pal's super exciting quest to reclaim their lost magic? With the mysterious life forms Cabion by your side, you can become a Cabion master and save humanity like the total hero. Protecting children's innocence while igniting their boundless imaginations. That's the magic of Korean animation. K-animation, the ultimate bestie for kids worldwide.
Well,
Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mo-gen. Tensions in the Middle East are again rising sharply after the first ceasefire talks between the United States and Iran collapsed without a deal. Washington now says it will launch a naval blockade targeting ships entering or leaving Iranian ports in a move aimed at cutting off Iran's key oil revenue. The decision comes after 21 hours of marathon negotiation in Islamabad ended in a stalemate with deep disagreements remaining over Iran's nuclear program and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has already warned of strong military retaliation, raising concerns that the fragile ceasefire could quickly unravel. So the key question now is whether this latest pressure will push Tehran back to the negotiating table or bring the region closer to another confrontation. For a closer look into the current situation, we are joined in the studio by Jong-un, professor of the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. A big welcome.
Good evening.
And also joining us online is Hassan Gon, visiting professor at the Institute of Middle East Studies of the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Good to see you.
Good to see you again.
So let's start a discussion with Professor Min. So after the ceasefire talks between the U.S. and Iran has collapsed, Washington said it will start a naval blockade targeting ships going to and from Iranian ports. Professor, tell us more about Washington's plan and also its motive.
Yes, it is known that U.S. military will begin blockading all ships entering and exiting Iranian ports at 10 a.m. Monday in Washington time. And the U.S. military said that the blockade will be first impartially against the vessels of all nations entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas, including all Iranian ports on the Arabian Gulf and Gulf of Oman. But the U.S. military forces would not impede freedom of navigation for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz to and from non-Iranian ports. And it is also said that the additional information will be provided through the formal notice before the start of the blockade. And it is known that U.S. want control over the Strait of Hormuz because it needed to strengthen its bargaining power, considering that Iran has used the Strait of Hormuz as a pivotal leverage to pressure U.S. through an oil price surge and the fears of high inflation in the United States before the U.S. midterm elections in November. And as you know, the U.S. and Iran failed to reach an agreement during the peace talks of the weekend. But there's still more time before the end of a ceasefire deal about it over 10 more days. And the U.S. needed to enhance its bargaining power by reducing Iran's control of the Strait of Hormuz. And I think that controlling over the Strait of Hormuz would be is the most powerful way that Iran possesses in terms of pressuring U.S. To get the more favorable negotiation outcome. But after the U.S. announcements about controlling of the Strait of Hormuz, the Iran that also announced that it would not yield to U.S. threats, and therefore the tension of the Strait of Hormuz is likely to be bigger and deeper in the coming the days and weeks, but probably days. Yeah.
Right, it's very concerning indeed. Now, in response to this, Iran has warned of strong military retaliation, which is raising concerns, of course, across the globe. Professor Gon, do you think the current standoff between the two countries around the Strait of Hormuz could actually escalate into an actual military clash?
Yes, actually, I think the risk is now very serious, though I would not say it is inevitable. The key reason is that confrontation has moved from rhetoric into operational military activities now. After the talk collapsed, Washington increased the pressure around the Iranian ports, while Iran warned that any military activities on the Strait of Hormuz would be treated as violation and would be met by retaliation. So that creates a very dangerous environment in that very narrow Strait of Hormuz. Which is very highly militarized right now. And that makes Hormuz especially volatile, is that escalation there does not need a formal political decision of a full scale of war. It can begin with a limited naval incident or a mine clearing operation or misunderstand the signal at the sea. So the real danger is not necessarily an intentional full-scale war, but an unintended clash that escalates faster than either side wants, because both of them don't want a full-scale war. So I think, yes, a real military clash is possible, and the most likely trigger would be a limited maritime incident rather than a deliberate decision for all-out war.
So we'll have to look into unintentional moves too. But Professor Min, when we take a closer look into the latest threat coming from Washington, the U.S. also would face risks like higher oil prices and the danger of clashes at the sea. Do you see this naval blockade as a way to gain leverage in negotiations, or just simply raise further tensions?
Well, as you know, the issue of opening the Strait of Hormuz was one of the main agendas in the peace talks over the weekend. And for Iran, controlling the Strait of Hormuz to raise U.S. and global oil prices and threaten the world economy has become the most useful means of confronting the United States. And for the United States, since the outbreak of the war, U.S. oil prices have increased significantly, currently averaging over $4 per gallon. And this deepens the concerns of President Trump, because stabilizing prices or controlling inflation is a key priority for the upcoming midterm elections. So U.S. demands Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz as the ceasefire negotiation in the way. But Iran is well aware of the situation and is unwilling to give up the control of the Strait of Hormuz, although ceasefire negotiations are underway. So I think the Iran want to use it as a valid bargaining tool until they achieve the negotiation outcome they want. So it is more likely that U.S. naval blockade would escalate tensions over the Strait of Hormuz in the coming days. But then, I'm not sure whether the U.S. efforts of controlling of the Strait of Hormuz would strengthen the U.S. bargaining power or the just escalate tensions of the Strait of Hormuz. It depends on how the two sides would respond to their moves respectively. So we'll see what will actually happen. But it's a little different, the subject and the argument. But I want to make sure that Iran should know that if it doesn't open the Strait of Hormuz, sooner or later, they'll get the serious consequences. Until the ceasefire negotiation began, many people in South Korea, in other countries, felt sympathy for Iran. So they perceived that U.S. and Israel started the war without proper justification. So even though blockading over the Strait of Hormuz brought economic hardships, they endured and watched the situation cautiously. But the economic situation in the world have got much worse, and they will not endure the difficulties anymore. So Iran should clearly understand that if it continues to block the Strait of Hormuz for its own interests, the responsibility will fall on Iran, not the United States anymore. So I think it is like Iran is doing a very dangerous gamble against the entire world. Of course, I think that the situation Iran faces is regrettable, very sorry for Iran, but it's no longer acceptable to cause further hardship to the global economy. So Iran should take this warning seriously, and I hope that Iran will make a wise decision sooner or later.
Right, it really should consider the impact globally as well. But when we talk about, the deal, when they have to make a deal, the negotiations part, it has collapsed on the 11th. And what do you believe has actually ultimately caused the talks to have led to a collapse?
Well, it is reported that during the talks, the two sides, U.S. and Iran, discussed a wide range of tough issues, including prohibiting Iran's nuclear weapons and its control of the Strait of Hormuz, and the ceasefire deal for Lebanon, and the release of Iran's foreign assets. And it was reported that they agreed for some of their agendas, but they got the huge gaps in terms of main agendas they got. So probably I think that the two sides could not narrow down their gaps on Iran's nuclear weapons and the control of the Strait of Hormuz. And personally, I think the prohibiting Iran's nuclear weapons was the decisive factor behind the breakdown of the talks. Regarding the nuclear weapon issues, the U.S. wants to see affirmative commitment by Iran not to pursue a nuclear weapon. It was like the red line that Washington clearly emphasized over and over again, like President Trump's comment that denying Iran any pathway to nuclear arms is the core goal that he want to achieve in the talks with Iran. But Iran has argued that Iran would not give up. It would not give up its right to enrich uranium for peaceful and commercial purposes. So it seems that the two sides did not want to make a compromise on the issue. And J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, said that U.S. has not seen any fundamental commitment of will by Iran not to develop a nuclear weapon. So I think that the similar result came out when they talked about issue of the Strait of Hormuz. It means that both of them, they were not ready to make a compromise. They weren't ready to take a proactive action to make a compromise. It'll take more time. But they still have about 10 days to negotiate before the ceasefire deal is over. So I expect that they will go through intense and tough negotiations for the upcoming days through the mediating roles of some other important regional countries. And they try to make a progress for the exits of the war.
Right. We'll have to look forward to that. But as our Professor Min has pointed out, the core issue, the United States, it has demanded explicit pledge from Iran to abandon nuclear weapons, but obviously Tehran has refused. Professor Gon, do you see any realistic compromise both sides could actually accept on this nuclear issue?
Yes, actually, I believe compromise is still possible, but only in a very narrow and heavily monitored form. Right now, the main problem is that two sides are defining success in very different ways. Like Washington wants a clear guarantee that Iran will not move toward nuclear weaponization, and while Tehran rejects terms that look like total surrender under pressure. So that is why maximalist settlements is very unlikely. The more realistic option would be a freeze and verify stricter monitoring, limits on enrichment and tighter oversight of nuclear activity, while the United States stops short of demanding total symbolic dismantlement of Iran's civilian nuclear program. So technically there is room for compromise, but politically it's much harder because neither side wants to appear weak. That means any workable deal would have to be narrow, gradual, and verification center rather than dramatic or comprehensive.
But at the same time, Professor Gon, some analysts say Iran was angered by the U.S. mine-clearing operation in the Strait of Hormuz during the talks. Do you think that kind of military pressure from Washington actually influenced this breakdown?
Yes, of course, I think it's likely played a role, though it's not only the only cause for that. The talks were already burdened by deep disagreements over nuclear issues, regional armed groups like Hezbollah, and Hormuz itself. So by carrying out a mine-clearing operation during negotiation almost certainly worsened this atmosphere. From the U.S. perspective, this can be presented as a defensive measure to protect shipping and to faster the moving for the shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, but from Iran's perspective, it looked more like coercive diplomacy under military pressure. So that matters because negotiations are not shaped not only by proposals on the table, but by how each side understands and interprets the other's intentions. So I would say the mine-clearing operation did not single-handedly collapse the talks, but it likely reinforced Iran's mistrust and make compromise harder by suggesting that Washington was bargaining from dominance position rather than a mutual de-escalation position.
So it did play a role with other factors still weighing in as well. Now, Professor Min, shifting gears, some reports say China may have actually tried to supply air defense weapons to Iran, but Beijing, of course, has denied this. If that actually turns out to be true, how could it actually affect the U.S.-Iran situation and also the upcoming U.S.-China summit as well?
Well, as you mentioned, it's not certain, it's not clear whether China has provided air defense weapons to Iran. But if it turns out to be true, there is a possibility that it will negatively affect the relationship between U.S. and China. But personally, I think its impact will not be that serious. It's mainly because regardless of whether it is true or not, China will be cautious in giving the military help to Iran in the coming days and the weeks and the months after the media report. For China, Iran is an important partner in the Middle East, and they want to maintain the favorable relationship with the country by providing various assistance and support during the war. Meanwhile, China doesn't also want to screw up its relationship with the U.S. due to the war. As you know, China is relatively weaker in its relations with the United States. So it's China's top priority to favorably manage its relationship with the U.S. for the political and economic purposes. So it is likely that China will be cautious in providing Iran with further military support. And it is also known that China played an important role in Iran's decision to take the ceasefire deal, and such an effort was well received by Washington. So if the Iran war finds an exit and the summit meeting between U.S. and China is held in Beijing in the middle of May as scheduled, I hope, China will be able to claim the credit for the mediating role of the war and positively affect the outcome of the bilateral summit. So we will see what will actually happen in the coming weeks. And it is certain that China did play a very important role in terms of the Iran's decision in taking the ceasefire deal. It's very important and great.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we look beyond this, Iran says Israel must halt its airstrikes on Lebanon as a condition for a ceasefire. But Israel has continued its attacks. Professor Gon, how do you see the Israel-Lebanon talks scheduled for the 14th unfolding? And do you think they could help ease tensions between U.S. and Iran?
Yeah, of course, I think Israel-Lebanon talks are important, but I would not overstate their effect, because from Tehran's perspective, Lebanon has become a test case for whether de-escalation is genuine or selective. So Iran has argued that a credible ceasefire cannot exclude Lebanon, while Israel continued strikes there even during the negotiations. So that naturally worsened Iranian mistrust. If the April 14th talk make progress, they could modestly improve the regional atmosphere. They may reduce tension on one important secondary front and create a small confidence building between the two countries, Iran and the US, but they are unlikely to become decisive breakthrough in the US-Iran conflict itself. The reason is very simple. The core disputes remain the nuclear issues, the Strait of Hormuz, and the sanctions and Iran's wider regional position. At best, these talks could lower the temperature. They are unlikely by themselves to unlock a broader settlements.
Mm-hmm. So developments there could have broader implications, but not really a decisive one. Now, when we look ahead, Professor Gon, how likely is it that the U.S. and Iran would return to negotiations within this remaining ceasefire period? And what conditions do you think might bring both sides to the table?
A return to negotiations before April 22nd is still possible, but I would describe it as possible rather than actually likely, because the diplomatic channels has not been fully closed, but the political and military atmosphere has clearly worsened since the failed talks. So there are three conditions needed for negotiations to resume. First of all, some stabilization around Hormuz, because active military frictions makes meaningful bargaining extremely difficult. Second, a narrow agenda, that the first talks tried to carry out too many issues at once, the nuclear file and the Hormuz and sanctions and regional fronts. So that is part of why they failed. Third, both sides need a face-saving formula, so that returning to talks does not look like a retreat under pressure. So the most realistic path is not a grand bargain, not a comprehensive plan, but it is a staged process. First, maritime deconfliction, and then technical nuclear understanding, like lower enrichment or so on and so on. And only later broader regional issues can be addressed. Under current conditions, that path is much more realistic than a comprehensive settlement at once.
So the window for diplomacy may be quite narrow at this point.
It's narrow, but it's still there. Yeah.
Yes, of course, it's still there. We'll have to see how it develops moving forward. Now, finally, Professor Min, if Iran ultimately rejects the final proposal from the United States, what kind of ripple effects could that have across the Middle East and the wider international community?
Well, it will be the last thing I want to deliver further today's news. It's my personal thought, but if the ceasefire negotiation do not ultimately succeed, it is expected that the world will witness another miserable Middle East war, full-scale war. If the ceasefire talks fail, the U.S. will likely consider the use of military force because it will be the only remaining option for the country. So it is highly probable that U.S. will launch military operations to capture strategic checkpoints like Karg Islands or the 7 islands over the Strait of Hormuz. And such military operations will inevitably result in U.S. military casualties, which will provide the justification within the United States for expanding the war to the full scale. Then it is highly likely that the goal of the war will change to deploying a large-scale ground force into Iran to get a regime change and Iran's absolute surrender. But consider Iran's tough terrain and its army, huge army of nearly 1 million troops, a ground war in Iran would drag U.S. into another horrible Middle East war. It is like the gate of hell would open. So therefore, whether the ceasefire negotiations succeed or not will be a critical turning point that could completely change the course of the war. So I earnestly and sincerely hope that U.S. and Iran will succeed in reaching an agreement through concessions and compromises and bring the war to an end in the coming weeks.
Right, we'll definitely keep our fingers crossed on that. But as for now, we'll have to conclude our discussion here at this point. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Min.
Thank you.
And of course, Professor Gunn as well. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.
The snow is accumulating rapidly. Temperatures are dropping fast, so stay safe out there. Look behind me.